that we're going to be involved with manual muscle testing. So speaking of individual muscles now, let's start to take our focus towards the individual muscles of concern. And so let's just pick a muscle. Let's consider, for example, the bicep muscle. And let's explore both the macroscopic and microscopic structure of the bicep muscle. Once we establish and refresh our memories about the structure of muscle, we'll then need to refresh our memory about how muscles undergo the contraction process. That's a process known as excitation, contraction, coupling. And we'll review the sliding filament theory. And those will be important to understand because when it comes time to perform our manual muscle testing, we're going to be asking our examinee to participate and to cooperate with manual muscle testing. And that's a voluntary cooperation that involves them initiating the excitation, contraction, coupling cascade. And so we're going to review some of the steps actually involved in taking a voluntary direction, either from you or initiated by the examinee inside their own head, and transmitting that intention into an active contraction of a muscle that we can then grade with our muscle grading systems. So we'll review that briefly. Then, as I promised you, we'll go over the lever systems of the body, and we will assign a lever system, meaning we'll assign either a first-class lever label, a second-class lever label, or a third-class lever label to each of the muscle groups that we're going to be testing here as this program goes on. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the different types of muscle actions which I alluded to earlier. And those include the isometric muscle actions, the concentric muscle actions, and the eccentric muscle actions. Okay, so let's review now some of the structure of individual muscles. Okay, so remember that skeletal muscle is what we call striated muscle, as opposed to, for example, smooth muscle, which is non-striated muscle. And when we refer to striations in muscles, I want you to think back all the way to your classwork in histology, where you would take a prepared slide of muscle tissue and look at it under the microscope. And indeed, once you got that microscope focused in on the muscle tissue, you saw these repeating arrangements of striated bands within the skeletal muscle. And the reason that skeletal muscle is striated is because muscle cells contain organelles within the muscle cells, and all cells have various organelles. As you recall, there are the nucleus, and there are mitochondria, and there's sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus, and all these different organelles contained within cells. And muscle cells also have those same organelles, but muscle cells are specialized for the production of myofibrils, specialized organelles, jam-packed, tight within each muscle cell are myofibrils. And the myofibrils are arranged in repeatable units, which are the contracting units of the muscle cell, and those are called the sarcomeres. And because the sarcomere pattern repeats repetitively throughout the length of the muscle cell, it creates this striated appearance underneath the microscope. So let's now take a look at the bicep muscle and trace the bicep muscle all the way from the macroscopic appearance of it, as you would see it just on the outside of your arm, all the way down to the microscopic level, and take a look at these repeatable bands that we call sarcomeres. Okay, so consider your bicep muscle. Now, if we were simply to remove the skin of your upper arm and tease out and dissect out the bicep muscle, we would see that the bicep muscle itself is covered by a connective tissue layer. And in muscles, we call that connective tissue layer the epimysium. That's the connective tissue layer that wraps around the entirety of the bundle of the biceps muscle. Now, the epimysium contributes and forms part of the tendon of the bicep muscle. And the epimysium then becomes continuous with the periosteum of the bone to which the bicep muscle is attached. And the bicep muscle is attached in several places. Superiorly, it's attached to the scapula, and then inferiorly, it's attached to the radius bone. And so the epimysium becomes continuous and indistinguishable from the periosteum of the bone. Then if we were to slice open the epimysium and start to dissect open the bicep muscle, we would see that contained within the bicep muscle are several bundles of muscle cells, and we call those bundles, we call those fascicles. So the bicep muscle is nothing more than a grouping of hundreds or thousands of fascicles. Now, the fascicles themselves are wrapped also with a connective tissue layering, and the fascicles are not wrapped by epimysium, but they're wrapped by what is called perimysium. So that's the next deeper level of connective tissue as we penetrate deeper and deeper into the bicep muscle. Now, the perimysium is fascinating in that the perimysium runs the entire length of this fascicle of muscle cells. And the perimysium also projects towards the origin and insertion of the bicep muscle, and the perimysium contributes also to the tendon, and the perimysium also becomes continuous with the periosteum of the bone. So this is kind of an interesting arrangement and interesting construction of the tendon. So far, contributing to the tendon, we have the epimysium and the perimysium. Then, if we're to further dissect the fascicles and we cut the perimysium off the circumference of the fascicle, we open up the fascicles and we see that contained within the fascicle are hundreds and thousands now of muscle cells. And muscle cells are unique cells. They're very long and elongated. In fact, they're so long and elongated that we refer to them as muscle fibers. And if you can imagine a muscle fiber in the gastrocnemius muscle of a 7-foot tall basketball player, you can imagine that those cells are quite long. And so we call them muscle fibers. So a fascicle consists of nothing more than hundreds and thousands of long muscle fiber cells. And each of the muscle fiber cells themselves are also covered by a connective tissue layer. And we call the connective tissue layer that surrounds each of the individual muscle cells, we call this the endomysium. Now, the endomysium, like the perimysium, is interesting in that it surrounds the entire length of the muscle fiber cell and continues to project towards the origin of the muscle and also towards the insertion of the muscle, and contributes also to the tendon at both ends. So a tendon is nothing more than the continuation of the combined endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium. And then that becomes continuous and indistinguishable from the periosteum that covers the adjacent origin and insertion bones. Okay, so now that we're down to the individual muscle fiber cell, let's open up each individual muscle fiber cell and take a look inside at the microscopic structure. Now, if we open up one individual muscle fiber cell and we open it up underneath the microscope, we see that within the muscle cell or muscle fiber, there are cellular constituents that are common to all cells. And as I said before, if you open up a muscle cell, you'll see a nucleus. In fact, in muscle cells, you'll see many nuclei. Muscle cells are multinucleated. You'll also see mitochondria for energy production. You'll see Golgi apparati. You'll see endoplasmic reticulum, which in muscle fibers we call the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And you'll see all these organelles, just like any other cell would have organelles. Well, muscle cells are specialized for the production of organelles entitled myofibrils. We call them myofibrils. And muscle cells are jam-packed with myofibrils because, as we're going to see, it's the myofibrils that contain the contractile units or the contractile components of the muscle cell. And muscle cells are specialized cells. Specialized for what? They're specialized for the purpose of producing contractions. So that's what muscle cells do. That makes them different from nerve cells. That makes them different from endocrine cells who specialize in secretion. And so muscle cells are specialized cells that specialize in contraction and or shortening. So they contain many, in fact, they're jam-packed tight with specialized organelles that ultimately produce the contraction. So we call these organelles the myofibrils. So if we take a myofibril and further break it out and look at it underneath the microscope, we see that the myofibrils contain specialized proteins. They contain proteins known as actin and myosin, and these actin and myosin proteins are arranged in repeatable patterns that represent the contractile units of the muscle cell, and we call that the sarcomere. And if you think all the way back to your lectures in anatomy and physiology, you'll remember that the myosin filaments comprise the thick filaments, and the actin filaments contributed to the thin filaments. And through the sliding filament theory, with a muscle contraction, the actin filaments slide over the myosin filaments, and we get a shortening of the sarcomere. Well, when you have a microscopic shortening of one sarcomere, and that shortening is repeated over thousands, hundreds and thousands, and millions of sarcomeres, that's how it is that we're able to create a shortening of the muscle sufficient to produce a joint movement. And for those of you that have the PowerPoint presentation, have a diagram here which demonstrates the sarcomere in both the relaxed and contracted state, and the contraction of the sarcomere takes place through what you'll remember as the sliding filament theory. Now, a full discussion of the sliding filament theory is not necessary for our purposes, but just remember that the sarcomeres are the contractile units of the muscle fibers, and the sarcomeres are comprised of two different types of protein, the actin proteins and the myosin proteins. And so then what happens is, through a voluntary, willful desire to make a joint movement or a muscle contraction, nerve impulses arrive at the muscle fiber through the motor end plate, the terminal end of the motor neuron, onto various points along the muscle fiber cell. And at the motor end plate, we have a junction of nerve cell and muscle cell, and we call this the neuromuscular junction. Well, at that point, there's a synapse made, and neurotransmitters in the form of acetylcholine are released onto the motor end plate. This causes a release of calcium from within the muscle cell, and ultimately, to make a long story short, we end up with a muscle contraction. And this is the process known as excitation-contraction coupling. Now, once we get a muscle contraction, the strength and movement of the associated limb and or segment can be modified by several factors, modified and influenced by several factors. And these are going to become important when we go through the process of manual muscle testing. So joint motion typically results from the body's anatomic structures acting as a system of mechanical levers. And if you remember back to your classes in either physics or mechanics, you remember that a lever is a rigid structure that is fixed at a single point. We call that single point of fixation, we call that the fulcrum. Now, once we have a rigid structure, a lever becomes a lever when two forces are applied at various points along the lever. And a classic example of a lever would be a crowbar. Imagine a crowbar trying to pry a stone out of the ground. So you stick this crowbar down into a hole in the ground, and the contact point of the crowbar with the ground becomes the fulcrum, and then the end of the crowbar applies force to the stone at one end while you apply force to the top of the crowbar at the other end. So here in this simple example, we see the three components of a lever, which includes two forces applied at some point around the fixed single point that we call the fulcrum. Now, in the human body, the rigid structure that forms the lever is the bone that moves about its axis of rotation at some nearby joint. And force number one is what we call the applied force or the effort force. And the applied force or the effort force is produced by the active muscle that we're actually testing. And in this example, we're talking about the bicep muscle. So in manual muscle testing, this force, the applied force or the effort force, this is produced by the examinee or the injured worker. And force number two, also known as the resistive force or the load, this is produced by the weight that's being lifted. In this case, we're talking about the distal forearm, wrist, and hand being lifted by the bicep muscle. So the resistance force is produced by the weight of the body part plus gravity plus another external force that is applied. And in manual muscle testing, the additional external force that's being applied is the resistance that's being applied by you, the doctor. Now, when we consider a lever and the three components of a lever, the two forces and the fulcrum, these three lever system components can be spatially arranged in different configurations, and that gives us the three different types of lever systems that we see in the body. So for example, with a first-class lever, the fulcrum is located between the two forces. The fulcrum is located between the applied force and between the resistive force. So the classic non-anatomic example of a first-class lever would be a teeter-totter. With a teeter-totter, you have a central fulcrum in between the two applied forces. And with a teeter-totter, the two applied forces are the weights of the two persons at the ends of this long rigid lever, generally made out of wood or plastic. So a fulcrum, so a teeter-totter is an example of a first-class lever. Now, a second-class lever, with a second-class lever, we have the resistive force is located between the fulcrum and the applied force. Or stated another way, the resistive force and the applied force act on both sides of the fulcrum. So, classic non-anatomic example of a second-class lever would be like a wheelbarrow. With a wheelbarrow, the fulcrum is in the front at the wheel, and then the resistive force is applied in the bucket of the wheelbarrow. We call that the load, a load of stones or a load of dirt. That would be the resistive force, and then the applied force is applied to the distal end of the handles that hold up the wheelbarrow. And you can see that this type of an arrangement is what allows us to carry hundreds of pounds of load in a wheelbarrow with only slight effort applied at the distal aspect of the lever. Now, a third-class lever has a different arrangement still. With a third-class lever, the applied force lies between the fulcrum and the resistive force. Okay, so slightly different arrangement here. With a third-class lever, the effort or applied force is on the short side of the lever compared to the resistive force. So a classic non-anatomic example of a third-class lever would be a catapult, where the resistive force, such as a stone, such as a cannonball, etc., is applied at the distal aspect of the lever, where the effort is applied at the proximal aspect of the lever much more closely or much closer to the fulcrum. It's the exact opposite arrangement from the second-class lever, in that the applied and the resistive forces have opposite positionings. With a second-class lever, the applied force is at the distal aspect of the lever, and with a third-class lever, the applied force is at the proximal aspect of the lever. Now, most of the joints in the body and most of the joints that we're going to be testing with manual muscle testing are third-class levers. There are some first-class levers in the body, and even in lesser quantity are the second-class levers. Now, of the muscles that we're going to be testing in the upper extremity, we're going to be testing the deltoid muscle, the bicep muscle, the wrist flexor muscles, the finger flexor muscles, and the finger ab and adductor muscles. All of those muscles are third-class levers. So let's think about it. All of those muscles involve a fulcrum at the local joint. They all involve an applied force to the lever, wherein the applied force is closer to the fulcrum than is the resistive force. And that makes sense when you think that the resistive force is that force that's applied by you at the doctor. And one of the major principles of manual muscle testing is that we apply our resistive force to the distal aspect of the bone or segment that's being tested. So it makes sense that what we're going to be involved with mostly are going to be the third-class levers. Now, when we get into the lower extremity, we're also going to see some first-class levers and even some second-class levers. But for the most part, we're going to be dealing with third-class levers. So let's talk about some common terminology that we use when we talk about levers and lever forces. And this will help us understand some of the leverages and mechanical advantages that we employ when we perform manual muscle testing. If you consider a teeter-totter, a first-class lever, with the fulcrum set very close to the end of the teeter-totter, we know that we can put a very heavy person at the end of one end of the teeter-totter, and that very heavy person can be in complete balance on the teeter-totter with a very light person on the other end of the teeter-totter, depending upon where we place the fulcrum. Now, we describe the force that the heavy person applies to the lever. We call that FA, or the applied force. And the distance of the applied force to the fulcrum, we call that MA, which is the moment arm of the applied force. And we're going to see that in order for this teeter-totter to be in balance, the product of the force times the moment arm on one side of the fulcrum has to equal the product of the force and the moment arm on the other side of the fulcrum. Okay, so FA is the force applied, the applied force to the lever. MA is the moment arm of the applied force. And then on the other side of the fulcrum, FR is the force that resists the rotation of the lever, while MR is the moment arm of the resistive force. So in order for the teeter-totter to be in balance, the lever applies a force on the object equal in magnitude but in opposite direction to the resistive force. And that's exactly what we're going to see when we perform our manual muscle testing. Now, the ratio of the moment arm through which the applied force acts compared to the moment arm through which the resistive force acts is defined as the mechanical advantage. If the moment arms are exactly identical, the ratio would be 1, describing a mechanical advantage of 1. Now, a mechanical advantage that's greater than 1 allows the applied or the muscle force to be less than the resistive force to produce an equal amount of force of rotation. Whereas a mechanical advantage of less than 1 is a disadvantage in that it allows the resistive force to create a greater rotational force than does the applied muscle force. And most of the muscles that we're going to be employing in manual muscle testing operate at a considerable mechanical disadvantage. And I'll give some examples of those as we go here. So just to expand on the levers of the body, we are going to be primarily involved with third-class levers. But other examples of a first-class lever that we'll find in the body that we commonly test with manual muscle testing would include the tricep muscle. When you do resisted tricep muscle testing, we're dealing with a first-class lever. And I have a diagram of this that I will go over with you in a minute. Second-class lever example would be manual muscle testing of the gastrocnemius muscle at the ankle. And remember that the second-class lever would resemble a wheelbarrow. And recall that with a wheelbarrow you can carry hundreds and hundreds of pounds of load. Well, that explains why the ankle and the gastrocnemius muscle is so strong and can lift the entire weight of the body many repetitions, because it's mechanically set up at an advantage. Because with a wheelbarrow, the moment arm of the applied force is so much longer than the moment arm of the resistive force that it creates a considerable mechanical advantage. And then an example of the third-class lever would be the biceps acting at the elbow. So let's take a closer look at each one of these arrangements so we get a good idea about the relative advantage of each of the joints and muscles that we'll be testing. So consider a first-class lever of the triceps muscle acting at the elbow. So let's just talk about this anatomically. With the tricep muscle, as you know, attaches on the olecranon process of the ulna bone. And when we perform resisted elbow extension, we are employing the triceps muscle to extend the forearm by pulling on the olecranon process of the elbow. Now, the ulna rotates about a fulcrum that's at the trochlea of the humerus bone. And for those of you that have the PowerPoint presentation, I have a diagram here which demonstrates or depicts the relative moment arms of the muscle force compared to the moment arm of the resistive force. And remember that a first-class lever is a lever for which the muscle force and the resistive force act on opposite sides of the fulcrum. So the muscle force in this case, which is applied by the tricep muscle, acts on the little tiny piece of the olecranon process, which is on one side of the trochlea of the humerus, while the resistive force acts on the long part of the ulna, which is on the distal side of the trochlea of the humerus. Now, the moment arm of the tricep muscle force is approximately 5 centimeters. Approximately a 5 centimeter piece of the olecranon process is on one side of the trochlea of the humerus, while the moment arm of the distal part of the ulna is approximately 40 centimeters. So the ratio of those moment arms, which is 5 centimeters divided by 40 centimeters, is approximately 1/8 or 0.125. That's below 1.0, so it describes a considerable mechanical disadvantage. And so therefore, you can imagine that the tricep muscles, compared to other lever systems in the body, are weak. And therefore, when you perform your tricep manual muscle testing, you're going to be employing less force than you would use, for example, when dealing with a second-class lever, such as the gastrocnemius at the ankle. So you need to take this into consideration with how much force you need to employ. And in very weak persons, you may consider even shortening the moment arm of your resistive force in order to more accurately gauge the strength of your examinee. Okay, so for those of you that have the PowerPoint presentation, I've actually done the math here for you to calculate the mechanical advantage of the first class lever at the elbow. And as we stated, the mechanical advantage is less than 1, and so therefore it's not going to require much force applied by you, the doctor, in order to overcome the triceps muscles with your manual muscle testing. So how can we use this information? Well, many times with manual muscle testing, what we do is we pit our strength against the strength of the examinee in what we call an isometric muscle contraction. Now, with an isometric muscle contraction, there is no movement of the limb or segment. So, based upon our definitions as we've described them, during an isometric exertion, the applied muscle force times the muscle moment arm, by definition, is equal to the resistive force times the moment arm of the resistive force. So that makes sense that if there is no joint or limb motion, that the forces operating around the fulcrum must be equal, and that you can picture that on a teeter-totter. If both persons on both sides of the teeter-totter are exactly the same weight and exactly the same length of distance from the fulcrum, the teeter-totter does not move. Well, in the body, that would constitute an isometric contraction of the muscle. Now, what happens when the product of the resistive force times the resistive moment arm is less than the product of the applied force times the applied force resistance arm? That causes a joint movement. And in the case of the tricep muscle, that type of movement we would call tricep extension or elbow extension. And that would represent a concentric muscle action, a muscle action in which the triceps muscles actively shorten to produce a movement around the fulcrum of the elbow joint, because the product of the forces acting in that direction are greater than the product of the forces acting in the opposite direction. So we now have isometric muscle actions and we have concentric muscle actions. What would happen if the product of the resistive force times the resisted moment arm was greater than the product of the muscle force times the moment arm of action of the muscle force? Well, then the applied forces, which are the forces applied by you, the doctor, would be greater than the forces applied by the examinee. Your force would then overcome the force applied by the examinee, and this would produce a movement around the elbow joint, not in elbow extension, but now in elbow flexion, and we would call that an eccentric muscle action, an action in which the tricep muscles are contracting. However, they're undergoing not shortening, but they're undergoing lengthening. And this is in the situation where the resistive force overcomes the applied force. And in manual muscle testing, we're going to apply all three types of these muscle actions. We're going to apply concentric muscle actions, isometric muscle actions, and eccentric muscle actions. Now, a second-class lever is a lever for which the muscle force and the resistive force act on the same side of the fulcrum. Okay, with a first-class lever, the two forces act on opposite sides of the fulcrum. With a second-class lever, both of these forces act on the same side of the fulcrum. And with a second-class lever, we have the muscle force acting through a longer moment arm than that through which the resistive force acts. And this creates a mechanical advantage greater than 1, because the moment arm of the applied force can be longer than the moment arm of the resistive force. And so therefore, due to its mechanical advantage, with a second-class lever, the muscle force required to lift the given load is much smaller than is the resistive force. And this explains why you can carry hundreds and hundreds of pounds in a wheelbarrow. Now, in the human body, there are not many examples of second-class levers, but the classic example of a second-class lever involves the action of the gastrocnemius around the ankle joint. And we are going to be using this arrangement in our manual muscle testing when we test resisted ankle plantar flexion. And it's interesting that the AMA guides place heavy emphasis on the importance of resisted ankle plantar flexion, such that, as I talked about earlier, with only a 25% loss of strength of ankle plantar flexion, this qualifies for 7% whole person impairment. So this is a movement that's important in activities of daily living, and it's a movement for which the AMA guides place large importance upon. So consider the movement of contraction of the gastrocnemius to elevate the calcaneus bone around a fulcrum situated at the center of the ankle joint. With this type of arrangement, the fulcrum, like the wheel of a wheelbarrow, is in front of the ankle and is in front of the gastrocnemius. In this case, the pivot point is at the metatarsal phalangeal junction. At the metatarsal phalangeal junction, and you can demonstrate this to yourself by simply rising up on your toes, and you'll notice that the point about which your foot pivots is a fulcrum at the metatarsal phalangeal joints. So with resisted ankle plantar flexion, the point about which the body rotates is at the ball of the foot. The applied muscle force is posterior at the calcaneus bone, whereas the resistive force, meaning the weight of the body coming down on the foot, is applied down through the center of the ankle joint at the base of the tibia and fibula bones. Now, because the moment arm of the muscle force is greater than the moment arm of the resistive force, it requires less applied muscle force to raise the body up on the toes of the foot. That is because this is a great mechanical advantage for the body in having a longer moment arm through which the gastrocnemius muscle can act. So what does that mean for us when we perform our manual muscle testing? What that means is when we perform manual muscle testing to check for the strength of resisted ankle plantar flexion, it's not going to be very efficacious, or it's not going to do you very much good to test your examinee in a supine position with you simply trying to press against the toes of their foot as they resist your attempt to drive their foot into ankle dorsiflexion. There's simply too much strength and too much mechanical advantage for you to be able to possibly overcome simply with the strength in your arms and hands. We need to employ other tests in order to tease out, or in order to discover any potential weakness that may be present. And we'll go into the procedure for testing resisted ankle plantar flexion here shortly. Now, a third class lever is a lever for which the muscle force and the resistive force act now on the same side of the fulcrum. However, in this arrangement, in contrast to the second class lever, now we have the muscle force acting through a moment arm which is shorter than that through which the resistive force acts. And the classic example of this is a catapult. It's a catapult. Now, because the muscle force acts through a moment arm that is shorter than the moment arm of the resistive force, this creates a mechanical advantage which is less than 1. So the muscle force has to be greater than the resistive force in order to overcome the torque, or the rotational force, which is produced by the resistive force. And in the body, a classic example which we will be testing is the bicep muscle. And in fact, all the muscles of the upper extremity that we test and that we're going to talk about here shortly will be third class levers. So consider the biceps acting to produce the movement of forearm flexion. Again, the pivot point about which the forearm rotates is the trochlea of the humerus bone, and the muscle force, the applied force, the muscle force, acts through its attachment on the radius bone at the radial tuberosity, as you know. Now, if you raise your arm to a position of 90 degrees of elbow flexion, and if you palpate the bicep tendon where it comes down into the radial tuberosity, and just sort of place your fingertip on the bicep tendon at the radial tuberosity and place your thumb on the olecranon process of the humerus bone. And if you look at that distance, that is the moment arm through which, excuse me there, I had a phone call. So the moment arm through which the bicep muscle acts is very small. It's approximately 5 to 6 centimeters from the medial epicondyle of the humerus bone to the radial tuberosity. So that's the moment arm through which the muscle force acts. Well, the resistive force is applied at the distal aspect of the forearm, or even in the hand if you consider a person doing bicep curls in the gym, or if you do your manual muscle testing by placing your hand in the hand of the examinee. You'll see that the resistive force, the moment arm through which the resistive force acts, is much greater, similar to the example of the tricep muscle. Now, because the moment arm of the muscle action is much smaller than the moment arm of the resistive action, the muscle force must be much greater than is the resistive force in order to create a motion or a movement around that joint. And this is something that we need to take into consideration when we have very small or weak individuals. It's not going to require very much applied force to exactly match and even possibly overcome the maximum force that your examinee is going to be able to apply in the opposite direction. Okay, so we can have several different arrangements of the mechanical advantage. We can have situations where the mechanical advantage is less than 1, mechanical advantage where the mechanical advantage is greater than 1, and situations where the mechanical advantage is equal to 1. And another consideration when you're performing manual muscle testing is that the mechanical advantage for any given muscle changes throughout its range of motion, because the moment arms change throughout the range of motion. And generally you can consider that the moment arm is at its greatest, especially in the muscle tests against gravity, where we're doing most of our test motions in the vertical plane. When we're testing in the vertical plane, the maximum moment arm is generally at the position in which the limb is at its maximum horizontality. So when we're considering the biceps muscle, and for those of you that have the PowerPoint presentation, when we're looking at elbow flexion with the bicep muscle, the perpendicular distance from the joint axis of rotation to the tendon's line of action varies throughout the range of motion, but it's generally the greatest when the forearm is parallel to the floor. In other words, when the forearm is at maximum horizontality. Now, when the moment arm is shorter, in other words, when the forearm moves either above or below maximum horizontality, and the moment arm through which the bicep muscle acts, the mechanical advantage diminishes and becomes even less than it was. And so therefore, in order for your examinee to create a motion around that joint, the muscle force must be great. Now, this is something that you can employ, for example, when testing very strong examinees. Let's say, for example, you have a muscle builder guy with big, huge biceps and very strong biceps muscles. Well, that might be the type of person that you need to place in a mechanical disadvantage by shortening the moment arm through which the bicep muscle acts, by placing the elbow in a position away from maximum horizontality, where the moment arm is at its greatest. Now, similarly, in concentric muscle actions where there's a joint movement taking place, the moment arm through which the resistive force acts also changes depending upon the position or the range of motion of that joint. So, again, considering the biceps muscle, if the maximum mechanical advantage for the bicep muscle is in a position where the forearm muscle is parallel to the floor, in other words, the forearm is at its maximum horizontality, of course, that's also going to be the position at which the resistive force is its greatest as well, because when the elbow is at, when the forearm is at maximum horizontality, the moment arm through which the resistive force acts is also at its greatest. And as the forearm moves away from maximum horizontality, the resistive force diminishes accordingly. And this may be also a principle that you will employ with your manual muscle testing. So let's consider manual muscle testing at the knee. How does mechanical advantage and how do moment arms and resistive forces and all these principles play out at the knee? Well, recall that the knee has the patella. And the patella is the largest sesamoid bone in the body. And it raises the question, what is the purpose of the patella? And just to remind you that the AMA guides provide large impairments for even small weaknesses of knee extension. And so the AMA guides consider knee extension strength to be necessary and important for activities of daily living. And so we are going to be testing resisted knee extension. So consider the patella. The purpose of the patella is to increase the mechanical advantage of the quadricep muscle. And it does that by maintaining the distance of the quadricep tendon from the knee's axis of rotation as the knee goes through various ranges of motion throughout the range of motion from complete flexion to complete extension. And it's the job of the patella to maintain the moment arm through which the quadricep muscle acts. Now, absence of the patella allows the quadriceps tendon to fall closer to the knee's center of rotation. This shortens the moment arm through which the muscle force acts and therefore reduces the mechanical advantage of the quadriceps muscle. So how can we use that information when it comes to manual muscle testing? Well, with manual muscle testing of the quadriceps muscle, because of the patella and the mechanical advantage that the patella provides, we may need to place that joint in a position of mechanical disadvantage in order for our strength, in other words, the resistive force applied by you, the doctor, to be able to come close to matching the strength of the quadricep muscle as it acts through a joint that has an advantageous mechanical advantage. And I'll explain proper positioning for testing of the resisted knee extension movement as we get into the section in this program on the lower extremity. So what are some of the key points here? Well, because most of the skeletal muscles that we will be testing are third class levers, most of those muscles are going to operate at a considerable mechanical disadvantage. So during manual muscle testing then, the forces in the muscles and the tendons are much higher than those that are exerted by the hands or the feet or whatever body part it is that you're contacting during your manual muscle testing. And so because we're going to be dealing with high muscle and tendon forces, we need to be careful And we need to be cognizant of the fact that we are setting ourselves up as the doctors to have a situation where our mechanical advantage greatly exceeds the mechanical advantage of our examinee, and this is going to place their body structures and their tissue structures under high forces. So we need to be careful, and we need to be cognizant of these leverage systems so that we get, number one, accurate readings, and then number two, that we don't aggravate any pre-existing conditions that we may be dealing with. Now, so for example, just to illustrate this point, if you consider the deltoid acts as a third-class lever, where the pivot point is at the glenohumeral joint. The muscle force acts at the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus bone. And then with manual muscle testing, our resistive force is generally applied to the distal aspect of the humerus bone at the elbow, or in cases of very strong examinees, we may apply our resistive force all the way at the distal aspect of the upper extremity at the wrist. Now, in this situation of a third-class lever, the muscle force and the resistive force are on the same side of the fulcrum at the glenohumeral joint, but the moment arm through which the muscle force acts is much shorter than the moment arm through which the resistive force acts, and so we need to apply our pressure gradually, matching our strength with the examinee's strength to make sure that we don't overcome and aggravate any type of condition that may be existing there. And as we go along here for the remainder of the program, I'm going to identify each of the types of levers that we're going to be involved with when we go to test both specific muscles and specific muscle groups, and I'll point out the mechanical advantage that we're dealing with, and I'll also give some precautions when those become necessary. And then recall, before we conclude this section, that with manual muscle testing, we're going to be dealing with 3 different types of muscle actions, and I alluded to these briefly earlier. There are 3 types of muscle actions. We have concentric muscle actions, we have eccentric muscle actions, and we have isometric muscle actions. And with concentric muscle actions, the product of the muscle force and the muscle moment arm is greater than the product of the resistive force and the resistive moment arm, and this gives us a muscle shortening action. If we're considering the deltoid muscle, this would allow the deltoid muscle to create a movement of the humerus bone in the direction of either flexion or abduction, which is the natural action of the deltoid muscle. With eccentric muscle actions, the product of the muscle force and the muscle moment arm is less than the product of the resistive force times the resistive moment arm, and in this case we get a muscle lengthening action. Now we need to be especially careful when employing muscle lengthening actions, because muscle lengthening actions have a greater tendency to cause injury and aggravation than do muscle shortening actions. Although there will be situations when it is appropriate and we will be applying eccentric muscle actions, we need to apply those very carefully, because we know that we're generating high forces within the muscle, and then with our own resistive forces we're taking measures to actually overcome those forces, thereby getting a muscle lengthening action. And generally, for the most part, with most of the muscle testing that we're going to be employing, we're going to be using isometric muscle actions. Now with isometric muscle actions, there is no joint movement, and the limb or segment that we're testing gets locked into position and does not move. Now with isometric muscle actions, the product of the muscle action force and the muscle moment arm is exactly equal to the product of the muscle resistive force times the muscle resistive moment arm. And when those two forces are equal, the muscle neither shortens or lengthens, and the limb or segment does not move. Okay, so let's review those very briefly. With a concentric muscle action, the forces generated within the muscle and acting to shorten the muscle are greater than the external forces acting at the tendon to lengthen it, and as a result, we get a joint movement. Okay, did you get that? Okay, let me say that again. With a concentric muscle action, the forces generated within the muscle that are acting to shorten the muscle are greater than the external forces acting at its tendon to lengthen it, and as a result, we get a joint movement. And this is representative of most typical type of movements. When we lift objects or when we move our extremities, we're employing concentric muscle actions. With eccentric muscle actions, the forces generated within the muscle and acting to shorten the muscle are less than the external forces acting to lengthen it, and as a result we get a joint movement. However, in this case the joint movement is opposite to the direction that is intended by our examinee, and this is a case where the doctor's force overcomes the resistive force, or overcomes the examinee's applied force, and we get a movement opposite to the direction that the examinee is intending. And then most of the muscle actions that we're going to be employing will be isometric muscle actions, and with isometric muscle actions, the forces generated within the muscle and acting to shorten the muscle are exactly equal to the external forces acting to lengthen the muscle, and as a result there is no joint movement. And this is the type of muscle action that we'll most commonly employ with our manual muscle testing.